All right, Rafe, the last time we talked together, I think it was probably a couple of years ago. Maybe it's been at least 1 year, maybe 2 years.
2 to 3 years, I think.
Yeah. And somewhere in that space in between, I think it was either a direct message or an email, some form of communication you sent me. It was it sparked my curiosity. You had mentioned something to me about maybe going through something akin to what someone might call an Augustine like conversion experience.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride. It's like uh, I feel in some ways I'm kind of back in a place of liminality more than I was when I messaged you, but I did have this really remarkable experience. So uh, where should I start the story? I suppose um, I've been curious about Christianity for a long time. I don't really know exactly where it started. I feel like it might have really been like music and the sense of um, something profound about the idea of the sacrificial God, right? God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son, right?
Mm-hmm.
That idea just kind of got stuck in my head at a certain point. And there may have been after or before I encountered Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson's work was very influential to me in conceptualizing the profoundly, to me, positive impact of Christianity in the West and the unique sort of spiritual legacy of Christianity in guiding us. And particularly the idea of the logos. And the logos is something that was beyond simple logical, semantic, ratiocination, but something like this deep embodied commitment to truth and willingness to track it courageously. That was very, very inspiring to me. And then, when Jordan Peterson did the biblical lecture series, I told my wife, I think I might become a Christian at the end of this. And I listened to him, and I was deeply, deeply impacted by them, but I wasn't a Christian at the end of it. And then I encountered John Vervaeke, and
Mm-hmm.
Vervaeke's episode of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis on agape was, profoundly transformational for me. And that idea, not just of truth as a highest value, but of love, and of love specifically conceived of as the love that is given without expectation of return. That
Mm-hmm.
you give love only because it offers the potential of good to come into being. And that the most profound spiritual truth we could have is that if we can operate more like that in our day to day, if we can treat the world agapically and we can treat other human beings agapically, that is, in some sense, the key to the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really inspired by that. And then I, my father passed away in 2023 on the first day. So I teach an 8-day seminar uh, every summer on his land. So he passed away on the first day of the retreat. Like, he went into a massive heart attack about an hour before the students were
Oh my
scheduled to
gosh.
come. And so
Oh,
I had to,
so,
like,
oh.
I welcomed the students, and then got a text from my brother that my dad had coded and that I needed to come to the hospital to be with him while he passed. And so I went and was with him while he passed, and then went back and finished the opening ceremony with the students and did the rest of the event. And, people were really shocked by my ability to show up through that. But my capacity to suppress my own emotions is it's a deeply realized
Vocal.
skill, and it has its own costs, right? And one of those costs is that my wife was really distressed in our marriage, and so at the beginning of 2024, she requested a divorce. And in trying to understand what had broken my marriage, I had to confront the fact that there were these patterns of dysfunction that ultimately were rooted in patterns of neglect and various things that happened in my family of origin, but really specifically in having been sexually abused by a very important mentor in my life when I was in my early teens. And so I was preparing to leave my house, and my kids. I had I guess an 11, 9, and 6 year old kids at that stage, and I was going to move out, and so I was laying there, and I called my mom, and she, or no, sorry, I'm trying to put the pieces here. So I was just kind of laying there crying, like really weeping, like, the kind of weeping that you rarely ever experience. And there was this moment where it shifted from being about my relationship with my wife um, to this experience of sexual abuse. And it was like the first time I'd really let my body open to the
Mm-hmm.
pain there. And then
Mm-hmm.
around that same time, I called my mom, and I was talking to my mom, and all this just deep, incredibly powerful emotion was moving through me. And I found myself saying, really completely surprisingly to me, like, I need to believe in a father in heaven who loves me.
Wow.
Like, I needed to hold that. And so I moved out, and I was living with my best friend at the time, or he's still my best friend, but I was living with him. And I was living in his house. He was actually in Maui, not where we live. And so I was alone in his house, or with roommates of his. And I was laying on the little bed that I made for myself, and I kind of was like, I need to believe that I'm loved, right? And I want, like, Christ, if you're there, I need to feel it. And I felt it. Like, I had this profound experience of this. The best way that I could describe it was the sense of, like, I suppose the expectation is that the love of God is sort of a comforting, warm blanket that you pull around yourself. But for me, it felt more like being a baby lion and having your father pick you up in his mouth, right? And realizing, oh,
Wow.
this thing is insanely powerful and terrifying, um, but it loves me. So there, there you go. Um, and So then, sometime after that, I went up to a waterfall that's about a mile away from the house that I grew up in. That was like a spiritual place for my family and for various other families. Various, like traditional people from the native religious tradition here used to go to this place and bathe in the winter. And so I went up there, and this was in February, and I knelt in front of this waterfall, and I was thinking about various ways that my dad had kind of failed at me, and what had not been passed down to me about how to be a good husband, and then what had happened to me. And I kind of said, well, if it's my cross to bear to be the generation that breaks these patterns, then I choose it. Like, I choose this cross. And I felt kind of this really intense sensation of tingling in the back of my hands, um, like through my palms, and my arms went out to the side, in the crucifix position.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like, "Woo, here you go. You get to do this. We're here for you,
Wow.
or I'm here for you." And so that was my conversion moment. Um, and so I then went through this MDMA. I did 6 weeks of internal family systems therapy, 6 days a week, and 1 day a week of somatic therapy. At the end of that, I did a MDMA therapy session, and it basically was like I shook. It was like an exorcism, basically. I
Mm-hmm.
shook violently and screamed and grunted
Mm-hmm.
and roared for like 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was like all the shame and pain and disgust and fear and anger that I had suppressed during my experiences of sexual abuse were just released. And in the aftermath of that, I could see uh, that because I had so much wounding around sexuality, that there was this part of me that always wanted to judge and hurt and kind of like just kind of control my wife. Like, I had this really beautiful image this vision. Um, I can't remember. I think I was like falling asleep, and I had this image of me standing in a butchering room chopping uh, meat, scraps of meat off of something. And I looked down at the like pile of scrap, and I saw that each scrap was a broken shard of a mirror reflecting a piece of me.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, this is this hyper rational part of me that wants to protect me, that's actually trimming pieces of me off to make me more, to make me safer. And then the vision moved, and I saw myself sort of projecting out these circles of light, and they were capturing my wife and shoving her into a box. And there was like a series of boxes, and it shifted, and it was like there was this other box like just above her, which was like the spiritual. And there was this sense that that same rational need to make the world apprehensible had I had taken away my capacity to be sensitive to the spiritual dimension of life.
Hmm.
And so I was like, well, okay, I guess I'm a Christian. um,
Hmm.
but I don't know what being a Christian means, right? Because I wasn't raised in the church, and I've never read the Bible really, and I don't know what it means to practice Christianity. So I had already attended the Divine Liturgy at a Orthodox Christian, a Greek Orthodox church here in my town, and so I started going back, and I started to read the Bible, and so I've been reading the Bible cover to cover. I actually just arrived on the Book of Revelations night before last, so I'm uh,
Wow.
I'm almost at the end.
You made it through
Um,
Leviticus. Most people give up at that point, Rafe.
I've gotten stuck on Leviticus multiple times. I skimmed Leviticus.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
did a deep dive on Leviticus, but yeah, I've I have at least browse my eyes across every sentence in the Bible,
Yeah.
uh, from from in the beginning to the
Mm,
first couple of pages of the Book of Revelations, and
mm,
I've gone to liturgy a little over a dozen times. And I have prayed as a Christian every night. So I will
mm,
recite the Lord's Prayer, or I got a little prayer sheet from the Orthodox Church, and I do that, and I
mm.
do a gratitude prayer for all the blessings that I had that day, and
Beautiful.
a kind of moral inventory of my own failures and sins and what I could do better, and then a reflection on all the people in my life. I'm not a huge believer in intercessionary prayer. I don't necessarily think that God answers prayer that way, but I think that uh, I do believe in the capacity to become an instrument in some sense of
Mm,
something greater. And
mhm,
then, and so for me, prayer is a way of aligning myself with forces that are far greater than me, and then saying,
mhm,
okay, well, my friends who are suffering in their marriages, my friends who are suffering with cancer, my friends who are hurting. Um, I don't know what's going to happen to them. I don't know if their problems can be fixed. I don't know what God has in store for them.
mm,
But if I could be a better vessel of their of of God's peace for them, then that would be a blessing that I would ask for and ask for repeatedly. So that's been kind of my journey. And then reading the Bible is very challenging, right? When you come to
yeah.
the Bible from Jordan Peterson and from John Vervaeke, and you kind of get some of the best sort of symbolic reasoning around what the Bible could mean, that would be really, really profound and powerful. It's a bit different to like read through the text, and it's challenging.
Yeah.
And so I feel a little bit like a 14-year-old who is
Mhm,
in that questioning stage of like, how do I actually integrate this, and what does this mean?
mhm.
Um, uh, and so that's where I currently am. So that's brings us up
Yeah.
to date.
That's amazing, Rafe. I appreciate your openness to share so many facets of your story and to do so publicly because, I mean, as you probably know already from your experiences of sharing it with the people in your circle and sphere, I mean, that's one of the things you'll get to as you keep going through the book of Revelation. There's this really interesting passage, maybe Revelation 4, where the saying is the saints. How do the saints overcome in the kind of like end of the age and in facing up against the powers of darkness, right? And I'm taking some
Mhm.
interpretive liberties there. It's not directly what the text says, but this is what the text says directly. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the
Mhm.
word of their testimony. So
Mm.
there's something really, really powerful about when we share our story, especially as it resonates with this profoundly. I mean, I think the thing that's most were attracted to the Christian story and the person of Christ and the Logos is, if I were to give any interpretation of what I'm hearing, Rafe, is this is the picture of this strange paradox of a slain lamb that rules over the cosmos.
Mhm.
That's the picture that John the Revelator sees, right? It's like kind of the unfolding of the story here, and he is caught up in this vision, and you know the layers of this. I mean, it's probably primarily for the seven churches in Asia Minor whom he's writing to, and the
Yeah.
persecution they're going through and enduring, and it's like people are wondering who's worthy to wrap up the story, right? Like
Mm.
who's worthy to set the world right. And he sees a slain lamb sitting on the throne, which is just such a weird picture. It's just such a
Yeah.
strange and alienating picture. I've used this question over and over, and so maybe listeners, longtime listeners, might be annoyed by me bringing it up again. But the place I always go to is like, well, isn't who or whatever killed the lamb the thing that's really in charge? And
Mm.
that's the strange paradox of the Christian story, is to say, no, no, no. The what's really at the core of governing all of reality is this slain lamb. And so when your testimony, your story bears witness to that, there's something incredibly powerful. So that's a long way of saying thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, a couple other things that stood out to me that I'm really interested in, and you mentioned like somatic therapy and kind of the process in which the pain and the suffering that you did endure, and we must all confess we are victims of suffering, but then we also enact our own suffering on the world, right? And
Mm.
that's kind of the
Yeah.
dual
Absolutely.
nature of sin with a capital S in the cosmic sense. Sin is a
Mhm.
principality, right? It like produces, we're enslaved to it, we participate in it, it enacts things upon us like the stock market, and yet we also participate in it in some way that precipitates or continues the cycle. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about, because much of your like adult professional work, the thing that you've given yourself to, has been about movement
Mhm.
and somatic therapy, and what you described as even the almost feeling of an exorcism where your body is shaking and trembling. We know, I mean, there's multiple layers to assess this from. The first two that stood out to me was, we see a kind of like natural somatic therapy oftentimes in the animal kingdom. So you take
Mm.
a wounded gazelle who's been attacked by a pack of hyenas, and somehow has survived, that you see that out on the savannah, that they will shake, right? If
Yeah.
and shake out that
I've had
pain and then get up and walk
I've done
away.
that, or I've seen that.
Yeah.
In 2019, I think I was invited on a pig hunt in Hawaii. It's the first time I'd ever been hunting, and we were told that there were piglets, right? There were young pigs, and we weren't going to harvest a piglet. We were going to try to harvest a pig, but the dogs that we had with us, they were supposed to bark up the pigs, but they would bite a piglet, and so we knew that we might have to rescue a pig. We'd been told that. So we were walking through the woods, and we heard this piglet screaming, and the hunter was like, "Okay, we got to go save this pig." So it was such a funny thing because we switched from like out there to harvest to like now we're rescuing this pig. And so I took
Mm.
off through the woods, and because of my parkour background, of course, I'm the first guy who gets there. So I'm jumping over canyons and sliding through the woods and dodging around trees, and I slide down into this canyon, and there's a piglet. It's about probably about 2 feet long, and the dog has bitten on it to its ear and jowl, and I grab the piglet and I grab the dog and I separate them and I put the piglet down, and I'm holding onto the dog. So the piglet literally only goes like about 15 feet away to the other side of the creek and then lays down and just shakes, like just shakes for a while. And then it gets up and walks away. So I had worked with shaking as a practice through one of my collaborators, Aaron Cantor, is really big on shaking as a emotional release practice and as a kind of
Mm.
grounding. And I found it really hard to let myself shake or to like access
Yeah.
the state that's associated with it.
Yeah.
There's a whole sort of tradition now of what's called trauma releasing therapy or trauma
Hmm.
releasing exercise, which is like intentionally going to the shaking. I find in our kind of I sort of lean into that Ian McGilchrist model here, where people in the modern West are sort of hypertrophied in our left brain. And
Hmm.
so when you're operating in that hypertrophied rationalist left brain perspective, that I think that is really powerful at inhibiting
Hmm.
access to the right brain. And what the MDMA did for me was it sort of like allowed the
Yeah.
right brain to assert itself.
Yeah. Mm.
And it wasn't just the substance itself. It was the substance with the intention and the healers who were with me and the work that I did. Like I was having full on psychedelic visions just through IFS therapy and somatic therapy that preceded the use of any substance. Um, but altogether, they created this very different experience. And it was also something that, as a child, I was very interested in God and religion and philosophy. And then in my teens, I rejected everything to do with spirituality because so many people around me were bullshitting through spirituality. They were engaged
Because
in
you were in a
spiritual
kind of
bypass.
counterculture family,
Mhm.
right? Your
Yeah,
parents were kind of
yeah,
counterculture. Okay.
yeah. And the mentor who sexually abused me also was involved with a Native American religious tradition called Sisiwis through something called the Red Cedar Circle. And so
Okay.
I was exposed to yoga and Native American religious traditions and Celtic neo-paganism and
So you were
all of
already in
these.
an enchanted frame, and maybe
Yeah,
is it fair to say that as you moved into your teenage years, you were like intentionally disenchanting?
yeah. I was looking for something that was reliable, something that I could ground
Yeah.
into. And I didn't
Yeah.
trust the people who were spiritual. I found more and more through my teens that people who claimed spirituality were liars and bullshitters
Hmm.
and
Yep.
morally irresponsible. And so that was obviously not a model that I wanted to adopt.
Hmm.
So, anyways, that's
There's,
just
yeah, no, there was another side of that that stood out to me. So you mentioned the phrase shaking, and there are a number of Christian traditions in which, um, I don't want to say uncontrolled because that would be possession. And Christians have been since the get go, I think, very try to be very clear on the difference between being like filled with the Spirit and possessed
mm,
by a harmful, malevolent spirit. And one of those key differentiators is like the loss of agency.
yeah,
So demonic possession is a loss of agency, where a filling with the Spirit, you don't lose your agency, and yet you feel a kind of overwhelmed feeling, I think, like akin to
mm,
what you've described already. But there's a couple of traditions, some of which I have very strong firsthand experience with in Pentecostal and charismatic circles. I've been reflecting on this a lot, as we were talking before we hopped on air about, the ways in which the last couple of years, I think for both of us, we have had instances of having to really deeply process some challenging, very challenging instances of suffering. And I have found that in my own journey of having to deal with suffering, and this is my first go around with dealing with some pretty, pretty soul breaking suffering. That as I was looking back, I'm fairly far removed these days from the Pentecostal and charismatic traditions I grew up in,
yeah,
and some of it for the same reasons that you mentioned, even though you weren't in those streams. There's an interesting It's an interesting challenge I think I'm still processing these days, where the highly intuitive people, those that are using a lot of the right hemispheric intuition, like the unmapped territory, trusting their gut, discerning of spirits, there's an incredible gift there for them to pick up on things that many of the hard left brain analytic Vulcans, to steal a
Hmm.
Star Trek reference again, that they don't discern. And yet at the same time, as you mentioned already, there's a propensity there to be succumb to bullshit and to oversee patterns that aren't actually there. And
Yeah.
so I think for a lot of the same reasons, I felt not that I ever walked away from my charismatic and Pentecostal background, but I needed more. I needed to have, to kind of checks and balances system. I needed other rubrics for interpreting and assessing the world. But as I look back, I think back to my teenage years, and I had a mentor that was at a leader in a small local Pentecostal church, and I would go to their church conferences. And I grew up in a charismatic church, but Pentecostals have a different sort of expression of worship that tends to be, for lack of a better term, more violent in their dancing.
Yeah.
Um, Charismatics might do what they kind of called, we called it the Holy Ghost hop, where they might kind of hop
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
a foot, if it's an upbeat song in worship. But a Pentecostal church at times felt more like a mosh pit. There was a violence there. And I've never been a dancer, but I
Mm.
was thinking back in this past year because I've had moments where I've felt like I got to go lift some heavy weights. I've got to go move. I got to go sprint until I feel like I'm going to vomit to get this thing out of my nervous
Yeah.
system. And as I was look back on my teenage years in that Pentecostal church, I wondered in hindsight how much that had played an important role in ways I didn't fully understand in kind of processing. This term gets overused, but in processing trauma, in letting things out of my system through a kind of giving myself over completely to the spirit. And I've always been a fairly high level athlete, but I remember leaving those Pentecostal tent meetings, for lack of a better term, drenched in sweat. The next day, my calves and my legs would hurt far more than I was an all state basketball player. It was an
Mhm.
exhaustion that overwhelmed any basketball tournament
Yeah.
I'd ever played in. And then in the charismatic circles, there's less of that, but I certainly was part of for years, in my early adult vocational work, traveling the country in kind of what's called like third wave charismatic circles. And what I saw and experienced in a lot of those, there was a lot of people would call it getting drunk in the spirit. So they
Hmm.
would kind of manifest signs of drunkenness, lying on the floor, laughing uncontrollably, shaking, and in that vein, we have a whole stream of very important in American history, a stream of the Christian tradition called the Shakers and the
Yeah.
Quakers, who got their very name from the fact that in their meetings, people would shake and they would quake. And that was actually,
Mm.
just as a quick history lesson, it was the vineyard. So I want to circle back around to the role of music in your life too, because the vineyard has become one of the more important charismatic denominations in the development of what many people would call like contemporary worship. And and the vineyard movement, I've got a lot of friends in vineyard churches and vineyard leaders, and the vineyard movement started when like kind of the founder of that movement was showing up at Shaker and Quaker meetings and
Mm.
kind of experienced something there after coming out of the 60s counterculture that for him was really attractive and really appealing. And it moved into kind of more evangelical settings, um, largely through the vineyard movement. So it's just interesting to see the ways in which, like, I'm always fascinated by the ways in which the biology and what we're seeing in
Yeah.
science, that it does have points of overlap so we can bring them together in harmony. So what was your I don't know. I'd love for you to drill down a little more deeply into kind of that experience of how what that was like in processing outside of just like a CBT. Like I'm sitting there and I'm doing talk therapy,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
which has benefits, and moving into I'm getting this stuff kind of out of my nervous system, out of my body, and processing it that way. Could you share a little bit more about what that was like for you and any insights you've had since that time?
Yeah. Can I ask you a quick question first? We'll
Yeah.
come back to
Hmm. Yeah.
that. Are you familiar with the artist Tyler Childers?
Yeah. Hmm.
Do you know his song "The Way of the Triune God"?
Yeah. Hmm.
Is that about Pentecostalism? Right? Give me that old time screaming and a
Oh,
shouting. Go
yeah,
up,
for
tell
sure.
on the mountain. Faith too
Yeah, and
strong
that
to be
that
left
would be a
out.
big deal, kind of like in the Appalachian South. You know,
Yeah.
there's the influence there of kind of old time Pentecostalism, Wesleyan holiness movements, which kind of moved into, you know, even if you read back some of the accounts of the First Great Awakening with
Hmm.
John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, there's some really fascinating firsthand accounts. A lot of people kind of dismissing some of the more mainline traditions, dismissing what happened in the Great Awakening because of reports. I believe it was, I can't remember if it was John or Charles Wesley. Someone will have to correct me in the comments. But one of the Wesley brothers was confronted about the sorts of what we would have called in our charismatic circles manifestations of the spirit happening in the first Great Awakening meetings. And he was challenged by somebody, and I'm paraphrasing his quote here slightly, but he said, well, the man that you saw at that meeting, I don't know what happened to him. I don't know.
Mm.
He was kind of expressing a little epistemic humility. But here's what I will tell you. He came to the meeting a drunkard and a wife beater. And when he went
Mm.
home, he gave up his alcohol and stopped beating his wife. And he's now caring properly for his wife and his kids. So
Yeah.
do with that what you will. Right.
Yeah. What comes up for me, and I know we're skirting your question there, but maybe it'll swing back around. But
Hmm.
it's a kind of important coda to my story there. I told you about my experience of conversion and
Hmm.
MDMA, and I always feel a certain tension talking about the use of psychedelics as part of my healing process. Talking
Hmm.
to Christians, I know. Uh,
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen Jonathan Peugeot talk about like like let's be really really cautious with this stuff.
Yeah. That would be my approach too. I have some people that I think it's a matter of how deep you get into it. And
Mhm.
I think there are some ways in which we always should be cautious. My caution is about opening spiritual doors
Mhm. Yeah,
without the right protection as you enter into that world.
yeah, no, I
But that's
agree
not to
actually
diminish your
entirely.
experience, Rafe.
I don't think that they should be treated uh, callously or carelessly. I've met a
Hmm.
lot of people that I would consider sort of spiritually injured through the use of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Um, but in my personal case, the coda to that is so the second time I did MDMA therapy was May 2nd, or no, May 3rd. So I did the first one on March 4th, and then the second one was May 3rd. So 8 weeks later. Um, and that one was really specifically about kind of working through any resentment I had towards my wife in ways that she had kind of failed me in our marriage, and also like forgiving myself for all the ways that I'd failed her. And I, the first time I was absolutely crushed for like 2 days. It was like the most depressed I'd ever felt. And then the second time I like barely slept that night, woke up with incredible energy, and was just like, I'm ready to go home. Right. I'm not going to
Mm.
stay and rest. I'm just going to go straight home. So I like changed my plane ticket. I flew home, and I had my wife and I had basically been. I had actually moved back to the house, and she'd moved out into an apartment. But we would spend our evenings together, like 5 or 6 nights a week. We were like just taking care of the kids, making dinner, like doing all the things that a married couple does, but
Mm. Yeah. Hmm.
without without the romantic element. But we wanted to make it as stable and easy for the kids as possible. But like I was sitting with her. I did this thing when she moved out. I our living room is arranged such that there's a like a big chair and a couch facing our TV. And so I would take the chair and turn it to face the couch. And that was an invitation for her if she wanted to talk to me, to come talk.
Mm.
And so she would always sit down and she would always say, oh, I don't need to talk that much. Like I would just need to talk about the kids and what's going on. And then like 2 hours would go and we would just be processing all the pain and all the grief and all the things that had happened in a relationship and what she wanted and how she wanted to be treated. And I was learning through the somatic therapy and the IFS and all the stuff that I'd been through to like really hold space emotionally. And I could just barely say anything for 2 hours and feel like this amazing thing would happen. And she would go to these really, really deep places of grief. And then she would come back the most joyful and the most like real and authentic that I'd seen her in years. She'd like
Wow.
play music, her own music in ways that like she was so scared, it turns out, to like play her own music in the house. And like all of a sudden she was willing to play music. She was dancing with the kids. She was doing all this stuff that she'd felt afraid to do for years. And I could just see that like the processing of the grief was the opening up of her potential for joy. And so I was working with her and we would get more and more intimate and more connected through a week of doing this. And then there would be some point at which she would realize like, I'm still trying to get her back. Right. And then she'd be like, no, that's never happening. And I had to like not argue with her. I had to not try to win her
Yep.
back or not try to like argue her
Mm.
back. I
Mm-hmm.
told myself early on in our breakup that like, she's heard all your words. She knows how compelling you are. She knows how articulate you are. You cannot cajole her or convince her or compel her through your words. You just have to shut up and
As
show
my
up.
as my wife says, you can put away the PowerPoint now. You know, I'm good at getting my PowerPoint presentations. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but I stored up this argument, right,
Mm.
for why I thought that ultimately we needed to get back together. And when I got back from the MDMA ceremony, I had this like deep intuitive sense of like, it's time, like say the things that you haven't said. And I said everything that I needed to say. And she was like really scared and like, it was really triggering for me to say that. And I was like, okay, you're scared. I don't need to say anything more. You can just talk to me now. And so she kind of poured out her grief for like an hour. And then I asked her if she was going to go home or if she wanted to spend the night in the basement. And she said she was going to go home. And so I said, would you feel safe for me to give you a hug? She said yes. And we had this conflict for some period of time in our relationship where I always wanted to give her a hug with my arms around her waist because I like the sensuality of that. But she often wanted to give me a hug with her arms around my waist because it feels more comforting for her. Like I'm 6'2", she's 5'2". There's something really comforting about that for her. So I was very intentional about like walking up with my arms like this so she could wrap her arms around my waist. And she just kind of melted into me and held me for like 5 minutes. And then, basically she ended up not leaving that night. And then the next morning we were together again and we've been together ever since. And,
Wow.
and it's been, wonderful, right? Like I think so few couples actually know what it's like to like truly be in a place of good in their marriage,
Mm.
right? A lot
Mm-hmm.
of people are
Yeah.
okay and they're hiding from all the pain and all these things and they can like get by in the day to day. But to be in a place where it's like everything that needs to be seen and heard will get seen and heard. And we know how to do the
Mm.
work together. And then the joy, right, that comes through that. So you judge the tree by its fruits, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the conversion and the use of the psychedelics, all that stuff. For me, the fruits have been that my marriage feels amazing and that my kids feel incredibly secure. And I feel like that my relationship to each individual child has been growing in leaps and bounds in the time since we separated and came back together.
Mm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I wanted to make sure that
Yeah,
part of
that's
the story
awesome.
got captured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. It makes me wonder how much you had a new capacity develop in you to be able to make the kind of first cruciform move, right? Like that's there's always like a standoff in all of our relationships in marriage and I mean, this extrapolates out. Like marriage is one of the core microcosms of, it's the one of the core symbols of,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
unlocking this paradigm about reality that is so profound. But it's always the struggle, right? Is to who will make the first Christ-like step. And I find it interesting that you had the wherewithal, the self-awareness to say, I am going to make a, you didn't use this word, but I'm going to carry my cross without somehow making it an instrument for me to get the desired outcome I want. Now,
Hmm.
obviously, I probably deep down in your soul, you were ended up getting an outcome that you had longed for deep down,
Yeah.
but you were not manipulating the situation towards those ends. And I think that's a very interesting, like the, what stands out to me about that, Rafe, is the way in which the cross, there is a sense of when I am carrying my cross, I am participating in Christ's suffering. There's a very hard line. It's very difficult internally to sift through. I am doing something to try to control the outcomes, which would be more pagan, right? So
Hmm.
sacrifice has always been at the
Yeah.
core of religion. And the difference, the fundamental difference between like pagan liturgy, pagan worship, and what has been Christian worship is the God who sacrifices, right? Or you that sacrifice to a God as an instrument. The sacrifice is the instrument for you to try to control outcomes that seemingly were outside of your control.
Yeah.
So there's a that great illustration of Elijah on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. Maybe in one of your past
Mhm.
couple of readings through of the
Yeah.
whole Bible, you remember that story. And the pagan prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel are, they're having the showdown about like, well, we've got this altar. When the fire from one of our gods consumes the altar, we'll know who won. And they're dancing around and they're even cutting themselves with stones,
Mhm.
doing this. And then Elijah prays a very simple prayer that cuts out all of the theatrics of that. It doesn't feel like he's trying to manipulate. He has a interesting, like it's a profound sense of trust that God will do what is right in this situation, and it happens in the pagan, prophets of Baal don't get that outcome, right? So
Mhm.
that's one microcosm of that. How did you? I don't know. Any reflections on
Yeah. No,
just
that
anything I've
definitely
said
like
to that? Yeah.
brings up something very interesting to me because uh, part of the pattern in our marriage is that I'm I lean into conflict. My wife withdraws from conflict. Right. I, at least on the surface, am able to sort of remain in a very like calm, and I'm very good at accessing words during conflict, and I'm very articulate as well. My wife's very articulate, but she can't kind of handle her
Yeah.
words as fluently when she's emotionally flooded. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of times our arguments would sort of end up biasing towards what I wanted in my perspective, just because I had a better ability to kind of like win a conflict with words.
Mm-hmm.
And like years of that and not understanding how to correct for it, even like this was a really interesting experience. So like a couple, we had lost our marriage vows. We wrote our own vows and we lost them for years, and just a few weeks after we broke up, my wife found them. And we were all going to go to a basketball game because my daughter was going to perform as a cheerleader at the basketball game. And she handed me the vows, and I read the vows, and I realized that like every way that we'd failed as a couple, we had written into our vows and told ourselves we vowed not to do it.
Yeah.
That was like 15 years ago. We knew exactly how we would fail as a couple, and then we walked right into every pit that we had already seen.
Yep. Yep.
So
I get that one.
it was so I was like bawling, but
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a tangent, but there was this, so I started to pray, right? I started to pray to God, and and I was very careful not to pray for a specific outcome to my marriage, right?
Hmm.
I would question, I would be like, but you say like what God has put together, let
Yeah.
man, no man put
Yeah.
apart, right?
Yeah.
But I always went back to thy will be done. That was always how I ended my prayer. I want the best outcome for lovingness for me and for her and for the children. And I don't know what it is. All I can do is try to show up in the best way today. Help me have the strength to do that. Help me have the grace to do that. Help me keep doing it. And thy will be
Hmm.
done in it. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
I was very like really careful about not
Hmm.
attaching it. Part of it was I didn't want to test God, right? Right.
Hmm.
It's not like, okay, well, I'll believe in God if you give me my marriage back, right? It's like I couldn't
Right.
set myself up to do that. But it was also like really like having the humility to know that like I had failed as a husband and we had failed as a marriage. Um, and so I didn't know what was really best for everybody. I had my own ideas about it, but the truth is always way beyond anyone's ability to do it. So having the humility to say like, there's some much greater force out there and I can just align myself with it. That was incredibly useful for me. And, um, and there was this, I'm trying to weave a couple things together here, but I'm gonna go a slightly different direction and come back. But
Hmm.
there was a so my wife told me she wanted to break up with me on December 29th, and we talked for like 14 hours that day. And then like a week went by where it wasn't clear if we were going to like separate at that point or we are going to go back to kind of couples counseling and try to figure it out. And she went away for a weekend to do like a ceremony to like purify herself and let go of things and figure out what she really wanted. And I was like meditating on what was happening while she was gone. And I really wanted to believe that she would see that like how much I loved her and how good we could be and that it was worth continuing to fight. And I had this little voice in my stomach that just said, that's not going to happen. Like, just let it go. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
And I called that the voice of my intuition. Right. And so this was like, in IFS terms, this was like the parts coming out, different parts. And, and so she came back and sure enough, she wasn't ready to try therapy. She was like, we've tried everything. It's not going to work. And so then I went back to that voice. I was able to find that like literally the somatic signal of this voice
Hmm.
comes from this place in my body. And I said, is there any way that I can win her back? And the voice said, yes. And I said, what do I need to do to win her back? And the voice said, you have to let her go. And then I did something that I don't recommend. I think this is dangerous, but I was like, how long is it going to take? And the voice was sort of like, it's going to take like 4 months, 4 to 6 months. And
Hmm.
that's precisely what it took. So
Hmm.
it was prophetic, but I don't think that's a safe one to ask. And I didn't think it was safe even at the time, but I needed
Right.
that.
You filed
Um,
it away though, right? Like
yeah,
that's one that you're like, I don't know what I should do with that. I'm just going to put that in a file folder for later review. And
yeah. So I had these voices that were starting to propagate, and then I had like the voice of all of these kids that had been hurt in me that I started to listen to, and then I had when after the conversion experience, I could kind of ask Christ for help, and I could have a sense of when His voice was in me, and it was not my voice. And as I healed and kind of like my life came back together, what I discovered, which was interesting, was I couldn't access a voice that I could trust was Christ's voice and not my own after a certain point.
hmm.
And I was doing the somatic work, and I was really specifically working on my relationship with my dad. And my dad was a brilliant human being in many ways, but he was really broken and flawed by the counterculture, and he really abused psychedelics and really abused marijuana and really bought into a lot of new age spiritual bullshit, which allowed him to behave in some very irresponsible ways. And I was really hurt by it. But I also loved him. And I reacted to the pain by not loving him, by like putting him away in a way that I didn't have to like care about him.
Hmm.
And I discovered that that was a source of a lot of like somatic suffering in me that I had stored it away deep in my like stomach and my intestines. And my intestines were like, were just sort of like shaking with pain all the time. And so I was working with this somatic therapist, and he said something to me which was really profound. He said that grief is an embodied skill. That grief is about learning to hold your body in such a way that it can allow the thing to move. And that's like being soft with your mouth and allowing the shaking and the intensity in the core. And that we as a culture are really good at swallowing our grief down, right? Stiff upper lip. And as I was driving away from that, I had this realization that it was only when I was able to like allow myself to experience the depth of pain that is part of our existence, and to grieve it, that was when Christ was clear for me. That's when he was available for me.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, I don't want to be there all the time. I don't like,
Yeah.
maybe there are
Yeah.
saints out there who can sup the grief of the
Mhm.
world's pain all the time and
Yeah.
can find the joy and the beauty and the connection to God in it. I'm not there. I'm not ready to
Yeah.
be there at all. Um,
Mhm.
but I was able to taste it for a second, and there was something profound, and it gave me a strength to show up for my
Mhm.
wife in her grief about the ways that I had mistreated her. Um,
Hmm.
and that changed everything, because in the past, I really resented her pain and her inability to kind of do the same move that I did with my dad of pushing him away and making him just not matter. She also had a narcissistic addict father, and he would come into our lives and disrupt it. And she would just be, anxious and hurting. And I was like, why do you let this guy do this to you? Right. Like, why not just be strong? Why not just be like, just push him away? Um, and then she would seem so affected by things from me that like I was like, a lot of it was, some of it really was like not me. It was the shadow of like the ways she'd been hurt before, like her
Mhm.
seeing that in me. And then some of it was me, and I wasn't real about it, right? I was like, no, I'm just being rational, I'm just being this. And it's like, actually it's motivated by all these dark forces inside me, right? But I can't see
Mhm.
them, but she sees them and
Mhm.
she feels them. And so there came the moment where it was like, I'm getting a little tangential here, but I think it'll work, and I'll wrap these together. One of the really beautiful moments, like my dad, for all his faults, he was actually really, really beautiful at the end of his life. He really shone at the end of his life in his love for his family. And so he died on the first day of the retreat that I taught in July. He broke his leg 5 days before the retreat that I taught in May. And that was the beginning of the end. He had cancer, and because of the
Mhm.
cancer, he got a lesion on his bone, which caused the leg to break. And then the leg break created the blood clot that gave him the massive heart attack. So the leg break, um, I was the first person in the family to be able to go visit him. And I sat with him, and he'd known he'd had cancer for a year at that point. And, but he had really believed that he was going to get over it. He was going to live to 100 and all this stuff. And like, this was the first time he really, truly understood that he was going to die. And he kept apologizing. He kept crying. And I never seen my dad cry. He was crying, and he's holding my hand, and he kept apologizing to me for crying. And I was like, this is why I'm here. Like, of course you're
Mhm.
scared. Like, of
Yeah.
course you're scared, right? Of course you're scared. And as I was walking away, I had this like deep realization that like my father couldn't tolerate his own negative emotions. And because he couldn't tolerate his
Mhm.
own negative emotions, nobody else's negative emotions could really be real to him. And so he didn't have the capacity for real empathy. And because of that, he became narcissistic in the way that he behaved. But it wasn't because he had some like conditional baseline narcissism exactly. It was like,
Right.
it was a strategy to solve pain. And then I realized that I'm doing the same thing. That's how I'm showing up for my wife. It's not as bad, but it's the same tendency that played out. And because I couldn't feel my pain about my sexual abuse, because I couldn't feel my pain about my dad's neglect, because I couldn't feel these things, when Beth felt those pains, I couldn't hear them because I wanted her to be able to shut down the same way that I was shut down.
Yeah. I can do it. Why can't you?
Exactly. Exactly. And so after all those treatments, what it gave me was this capacity to just sit with her pain. And really, I feel like I'm able to do that for people in general in a way that I was never able to access before. I could do it kind of around retreats and seminars, but it's like, it just happens now. And you just see the way that it impacts and moves people. It's like people don't feel held in their pain.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't feel like they can even let it be real a lot of the time. And that the power to just be like, hey, it's okay. Right? I can see it. I can feel it with you. And I can just sit with you while you feel it. And you're safe and you won't die from feeling it.
Okay, that's it. Yeah. The ability to confront the fear. So this is something I've learned in the last year here is, you know, it's interesting to see that your journey here, Rafe, and through what we might say are like therapeutic pathways, like from a clinical perspective. There's also the thing that seems beyond the clinical therapeutic. There's the spiritual. I mean,
Mhm.
these things are
Yeah.
happening at the same time. But I think we both have lived through an era of this um, salvation, therapy as salvation narrative,
Mhm.
and much of it I remember. Kind of turn of the millennium, we get into the aughts and early teens, and a lot of the increasing awareness of, well, you just need to go to therapy for everything. That kind of
Yeah.
became like, well, you don't need to go to church because church isn't actually going to solve your problem. You don't need to do
Mhm.
this. You just need to go to therapy. And a lot of the interesting things that were kind of coming up in the more therapeutic circles, and a lot of it kind of just, self. There's a lot of like TikTok and YouTube therapy stuff out there that isn't rooted in anything scientific. But there has been a strand of it that has actually increased the tendency of people to ruminate,
Mm.
to actually not confront things they're afraid of, and to use avoidance strategies. So I'll use a
Yeah.
real common example here. So someone dealing with an anxiety about something, right? One of the things that I think people have wrongly misunderstood is they will use things like breath work. They will
Mhm.
use things they will use, just stick with breath work, for example. They will use breath work as a way to actually not confront the thing they are afraid of, but to change as a method of like changing the channel. And yes, we need to increase oxygen so that we get control of our prefrontal cortex and we're not in fight or flight. But one of the things I've learned in the past year from some of the top specialists in this at the Mayo Clinic was a practice of actually, instead of when you feel anxious about something or even feeling depressed, or you feel that fear, the fear that I am not going to make it through here, this thing will kill me, this thing will destroy me, this thing will be the end of my story, is they actually encouraged a new practice, which is to say the thing you're most afraid of out loud over and over and over again
Mhm.
until you become
Yeah.
bored with it.
Yeah.
And there are a number of things that will actually kill us. Like
Mhm.
there are legitimate fears. This thing will kill me. But most of what we are afraid of are things that won't kill us. And it's found in the confronting of that fear. And this is something like I think Peterson was really strong on from the get go. Is, if you have a phobia of being in a going into an elevator, you don't just avoid it your entire life. You make progressive steps towards that thing to not necessarily decrease your fear, but to increase your resilience and bravery. And so that I find that really interesting, that your ability, and this is hard for men in
Mhm.
particular, right? To whether it's your dad, there's an interesting thing I think we probably could take some time to unpack here, is the ways in which um, the I am I'm not going to deal with the feelings of my internal world because that's a sign of some sort of weakness.
Yeah.
And what it ends up doing is it's actually it's actually like the least masculine thing you could do, because it actually allows the thing you're afraid of to rule and reign over you and just dominate you, keep you pinned to the mat, instead
Yeah.
of saying like, I'm going to come face to face with this, and in wrestling with it, I'm going to realize that it actually doesn't have the capacity to kill me. And if it is
Mm.
going to do me harm, God, with your help, I will make it through. Right.
Hmm.
On the other side of this. So there's that turning over of, it's like a Kierkegaardian leap of faith when you are sitting there going, what I really, really want is, I do want to be reconciled to my wife. I do want to have a different story than, I'm going to break some generational patterns here. I want to be the proper father to my a father figure to my children. But this weird paradox in that I have to allow myself to to sit with that fear that my efforts in that direction might not yield that result. Is that kind of
Mm.
what the conclusion you had to come to, is that
Yeah.
it won't be because of my best efforts? And so there's a confronting of my own limitations there, to say, this is really hard to say, right?
Yeah.
Maybe my best isn't good enough,
Hmm.
and to sit with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Faith in something higher, and capacity to, for some reason I want to tell you this other vision that I had. It was like,
Please do.
one of my big fears is claustrophobia. Right, so I can handle jumping between tree branches at height. I can fight people. I can do all these crazy things. Right, but I'm pretty uncomfortable with getting into tight spaces. And like, if I see a story about someone who fell and died, it doesn't bother me, right? If I feel someone is assaulted and died, it doesn't bother me. But if I see a story of somebody who like got stuck in a inside a cave and like died, like, it just terrifies
Yeah.
me.
Hmm.
So I was falling asleep one night, and I was trying to tell myself a story as I was falling asleep, because I'll do that to help myself fall asleep. And I was thinking about uh, like a scenario that would like really grip me to tell. And so I started to tell this story of someone who's trapped underground. And as I was telling the story, I started to drift off to sleep. And so then it was me who was stuck underground.
Hmm.
And when I was stuck underground, I had this sense that, uh, well, people knew that I was underground and that they were coming to try to save me. But there was nothing that I could do to save myself. That it was not possible for me to dig myself out. I couldn't help them. But there was a limited supply of oxygen in the cave. And so all I could do was rest until they
Hmm.
came. All I could do was do my best to trust that they were trying to save me, and that I just had to let them save me. But that I might die, right? They might not get there in time. Could I rest? Could I do it? Could I actually not panic and dig and scrabble to try to survive and use up my oxygen and end up dying because of my own efforts?
Hmm.
And I was like, no, I would die. I would kill myself, right? Like, I would
Mhm.
shorten the end by panicking in this situation. And I had the idea of having the spiritual capacity to lay there and be grateful for the life that I had lived, to remember the blue of the sky and the green of the grass and the feel of the breeze on my skin and the feel of my wife's arms around me and the sound of my children's laughter, and to make it so real to me that I could lie there under the threat of death in the most terrible way that I could and say, God is good
Hmm.
and the world is good, and I am glad for every moment that I was given. And that's what I want, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
spiritual strength that I want to reach for. And I don't have it. I'm not there.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the work in some sense, is
Mm-hmm.
to get to that place, to remember the goodness of God, the goodness of the world when we are being burned alive. And we know that the Christian saints did that, right?
Yeah.
We know that
Yeah.
Christ was the exemplar of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, and I can't remember the question that brought that up, but it has to do with this capacity to tolerate the intensity of our capacity for suffering and remember the good, um, and then to be able to offer that to the people around us.
Mm-hmm. What about confronting our finitude? You know,
Hmm.
what role for you in this journey? And I would speak to my own experience. I think one of the things I'm trying to grow in is this interesting space between apathy, right, which would be to say I have my agency does nothing to make any difference in the world.
Hmm.
And then on the extreme end, a kind of like obsessive compulsive, I'm not saying I have clinical OCD or anything like that, but a sense in which the other ditch of high agency in the world is a sense in which I am the author of this story that
Yeah.
I am
Oh yeah.
living in, right? So it's
Hmm.
the radical self-authoring in the other ditch, that it's all on my shoulders. It's all up
Hmm.
to me. And that navigating those spaces in between are, maybe that's the narrow way, right? It's like
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
there's
that's the
some
Serenity Prayer,
place.
right?
Yeah, yeah, there is something to that, and the way in which and learning how to discern in the moments. Is this a time in which I need to exert my agency as an agent of God's renewing work in the world? Am I, as you were saying right earlier
Hmm.
on, you were like turning yourself over in an act of surrender to carry the cross, to be an agent of participating in Christ's work of renewal in the world. There's a succumbing, a giving up. There's kind of a strangeness to that, right? There's a surrender, and yet it's not total passivity either, right? It's
Hmm.
it's not a. I think this is one of the more just practically day in and day out difficult things to navigate. Is you use this illustration of feeling trapped in a cave, right? And
Hmm.
I have to confront my finitude. My
Yeah.
finitude is a good limitation. I am
Yeah.
not inherently infinite. And for Kierkegaard, for example, right? It's like Kierkegaard called it the authentic self. The authentic self is when we come up to face with our finitude, recognizing our need and dependence on the infinite. And the authentic self is the synthesis of the finite and the infinite. And it's
Hmm.
in that place of dependence, but navigating that space between I'm turning myself over in complete apathy. Like I can't do anything about my marriage and my kids. Like, and that gets to something like something akin to a, a, a lack of masculine asserting yourself, right? There is
Hmm.
something to that, so you help people spar,
Yeah.
practice combat in a safe and controlled way. But this very, very much from competition, and is like, there's a place for me to assert myself
Hmm.
as an agent in this, to draw a line in the sand, to make an act. So you made an active pursuit of your wife
Yeah.
in reconciliation, while simultaneously, this is the paradox for me, Rafe. So
Yeah.
you're taking that proper masculine step of pursuit. So
Hmm.
I am here to pursue, and yet you were turning over in that moment the outcome of it
Hmm.
to being beyond your own agency. I mean, what is that?
Yeah. Uh,
Does that make sense? Like
no,
there's a strange
absolutely.
paradox in there where like you could be tempted on the other side to total passivity, right?
Hmm.
And this is a real problem for young men, that I think you've had a particular calling. You've worked with men
Hmm.
and women, but a
Yeah.
particular calling to help young men in particular get out of nihilism, apathy, and just passivity. It's like, I'm having to explain to my son who's 17, kind of like bracing him for the adult world. And I'm like, you know, the sports thing that you're doing now is going to end, but I want you to learn how to assert yourself in the
Hmm.
things that you've worked on, because one day you will sit in a job interview and you will have to make a case to somebody as to why you are the person that should
Hmm.
fulfill this particular role up against potentially hundreds of other competitors. You will one day, God, Lord willing, propose to a girl who
Hmm.
has a range. Like, they are doing the selecting. Like, we know this, right? Like,
Hmm.
women do the selecting, men are competing to be selected.
Yeah.
And so there's an assertiveness you have to have. And yet, as you're learning in this process, and I'm learning in my own process, is that like there's a ditch on that other side of going like, it's up to me to control all of these outcomes. So I'm either too passive, or
Hmm.
too I am God, right? I am in the position of God, and navigating that space in between was something that by the grace of God you were able to navigate. Do you have any, could you give some self-reflection on like that, your active agency, assertiveness to put yourself in that place, and yet a degree of relinquishing control? It's like grace. It's like the grace works dynamic. There's a lot in there, Rafe.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. I mean, it is a paradox, and I think that this is one of those places where that capacity to access the right brain is really helpful, because I think
Yeah.
that we want sort of closure, right? We want to be able to say, okay, this is the answer to free will and predeterminism, and it's like maybe there isn't, right? Like maybe that's not accessible to us. Maybe we just have to like live in the paradox of it, right? That's one of the things that I really love about Taoism, right? Like the way that can be spoken
Yeah.
is not the
Mhm.
eternal way. Like we can try to understand the way,
Yeah.
but we kind of have to live it, right? We have to live and find it. And um, I, I was thinking a lot about faith right around the time that my wife and I broke up, right? I had, or maybe I had a conversation with Jordan Hall right after I broke up with my wife, like within the week. It was a pretty interesting conversation. But he was talking about the idea that pistes, it doesn't mean acceptance of an assertion without evidence, which is sort of how it's become interpreted. It
Mhm.
means it's actually like etymologically related to like skill. It's like an embodied skill in a sense. And that's what he told me, anyways. And there's this sense of it as like when I do a jump, I have faith that I'm going to make it to the other side. Otherwise, I wouldn't do the jump. But
Mhm.
I don't have certainty. Right? I could
Yeah.
never actually have certainty. And so, uh, but we, but you know, Jordan's point about this was that we don't actually act off of certainty about things most of the time, right? We have to act on faith most of the time. And then our
Yeah.
capacity for faith is both part of the skill, right? I have faith because I've done the thing, but I also have faith because I have the skill of faith. I've
Mm.
learned to trust myself in those situations. And so when my wife and I separated, I read Corinthians, right? Chapter 13, right?
Mhm.
Love is patient, love is kind. And I thought about the Christian virtues of faith and hope and love. And I said to myself very, very, very simply, like, I believe in my wife. I believe in her character. I believe that she is loyal and that she is loving and that she wants the best for herself and for me and for our children. Absolutely. And I have faith in myself that I have the willingness and the skillfulness and the strength of character to make the changes that she needs to make our marriage actually work. And because of that, I have hope. And then I can operate in
Mm.
love. And that was my mantra to like hold me through that time, those 4 months of separation. I choose to believe that my wife is not a cruel, vindictive person who's pushing me away because she's dumb or evil or anything, right? I will trust her pain and I will let it be real. And I will trust myself to be able to grow into being the type of person who can actually be the support she needs in it. And that was what gave me hope.
Hmm.
And then I chose the first time I drove back to the house after I left the house. You know, I sat in the driveway and I said, that woman in there, she's not your wife anymore, but she is the woman you love. You have to accept that she's not your wife anymore, but she's the woman you love, and you can be the best ex-husband she could possibly have. And that was what I chose, right? And then what I watched was, how does it impact her and the kids? Right. And I chose that path, and she opened up and she started sharing herself with me, and she grieved, and then she was joyful, and the children became less anxious and more secure and more open.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been the thing. It's like I have faith in my capacity for agency because I watch the impact of it. And I also recognize that that my agency in the world is also profoundly limited because I wasn't able to save my father, and I'm not able to save the
Wow.
marriages of my friends who are near me, and I'm not able to prevent the suffering of lots of people, right? Like
Yeah.
I had this meditation. I've been thinking a lot about the idea, and this is a bit of a tangent, but for some reason I really wanted to talk to you about it, and I think maybe it'll connect. I think that a lot of what we call trauma in modern therapeutic culture might better be conceived of as sin. And I think that returning to the idea of sin, for all of its loading and all of its limitations, is actually sort of spiritually and epistemically more powerful.
Mm.
I've been playing with this for a while, but it just really popped for me a couple days ago. So I was a insufficient and at times cruel and tyrannical husband. Why? Well, I was sexually abused and I was neglected. Well, why did that happen? Well, my sexual abuser was sexually abused. Well, why did that happen? It's like, I don't know. We go all the way back to Cain. I don't know. When does it begin? Right.
Right.
Um, it, it's like, and then there's this thing of like, I've excused myself from culpability, right? Oh, but please don't, please don't be mad at me for being an asshole because look at what happened to me.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, no. Um, and then even like I think about, okay, so my job as a man, uh, as the son of a father and a mother, of a lineage, and the father of children, is in some sense to break the chains of trauma that have been passed down to me. But if I just think of it as trauma, then I will neglect the fact that I have an inherent capacity for evil that is in me. That doesn't have anything to
Mm-hmm.
do with what was passed for me. That's just because I'm a specific person and I have limitations and I have drives and qualities and capacities that are in conflict with each other, because that's what it means to be a human being. And my children, their problems are not because I'm an asshole and their grandparents were flawed. They also are human beings with the capacity for sin. And if I remember that, if I say, look, I don't know if I showed up in a bad way in this specific situation because of something that happened to me, or just because my nature is insufficient and flawed, just like everybody else's nature. what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to account for all of it, to work through all of it, to grow my character. And then when I look at my children, I can do the same thing. I can say, hey, sometimes you show up in a way that's like not pleasant to be around. And I don't think it's going to work well for you in life. And some of that is because I messed up, right? I wasn't there for you at a stage that you needed to be around for you. Or I tried to do something smart in a really dumb way. That's a classic pattern of mine. And then some of it is also because like your personality is also going to give you
Yeah.
difficulties in life and you're going to have
Mm-hmm.
to overcome them. And so it's not just my role to like not break you. It's my role to help you recognize the ways you will break yourself and overcome them.
Hmm.
And I just think that's so much more powerful
Yeah.
than everything is trauma and it's all trauma, right? It's like, no. And it also is important because there's such a huge difference between the type of trauma that just happens to you. It's like, man, somebody got cancer. That's trauma, right?
Yeah.
And somebody betrayed you. Someone slept with your wife. Somebody like cheated you out of a business deal. The impact that we have of malevolence and evil on our psyches is not the same. And the impact of our own malevolence. It's like if you, like hurt somebody in an accident, you're going to feel bad. But if you hurt somebody because you wanted to hurt them and then you hurt them worse than you meant to hurt them,
Mm-hmm.
that's gonna sit with you for a lot longer. So I think that taking up that responsibility, that's really important and profound. And I think that therapy culture, it doesn't give us all that these traditional spiritual practices gave us because of the way that it collapses into scientific determinism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
And
that's just a line of stuff.
no,
Go ahead.
I'm totally tracking with you on that because the way in which it makes you, um, it can foster a perpetual victim mentality, which is one of the problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which decreases our agency in the world.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, but then on the flip side, it actually decreases our awareness of the ways in which we are active participants in
Mm-hmm.
going against the grain of God's intended order for reality. Like I
Yeah.
am actively in this area, in this area. I have these desires in me, which, the Apostle Paul talked about, right? Like the thing I
Mm-hmm.
want to do, I don't. And the thing I don't want to do, I still do anyways. And we recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been an interesting recovery recently. Much of the post-Reformation reading of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament has tended to be in kind of the Luther Calvin um, lens, which
Yeah.
some might call it, tends to focus on the forensic aspects of salvation, a legal framework like
Mm-hmm.
justification. I was a sinner and I was condemned and now I need to be justified. And there's a legal forensic process. And there's some value to that. But I've been interested in the past maybe 20 years or so. There's been a recovery of something that kind of invites people to step into the more first century worldview of the Greco-Roman world. And it's called the apocalyptic reading of Paul,
Yeah.
in which Paul, when he talks about sin, like in places like in Romans, he is using it as what we might call, like in a lot of our circles, a hyper object. It
Mm-hmm.
is something that is beyond us, and yet we also participate in, like the stock market.
Yeah.
And so, yes, what the stock market is doing things, the economy, we'll use that term, right? Because that's that we're all feeling the weight of the economy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's what drives, like, realistically, that's what drives every presidential election. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
who can turn that principality? You know?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
we
Who
all
can grab?
participate in it. We're born into it, and we are victims of things that we did not choose. And so there
Mm-hmm.
is a degree in which a sort of like motherly consolation and care is appropriate for
Yeah.
saying, Rafe, the thing that you never chose was brought upon you was terrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to actually say that out loud and to free ourselves from the shame in which I did not actively choose to participate in that thing. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not wild about my dollars purchasing power declining. I didn't really do anything to have that happen. My kids are inheriting a world in which it's far more difficult for them to purchase a house than it will
Yeah.
be for, unless some things change, it was for my wife and I. That's not right. And we should name that as something that, yeah, there's pain that has been inflicted on you that should be treated with a degree of nurture, care, consolation, empathy, sympathy. And yet there's another part of that in which I do have to confront that I have within me this aptitude to move away from the good, which I
Absolutely.
do participate in. So there's always kind of this interesting thought experiment, right? You probably are aware of this, but a lot of people know, like, I'm very fascinated with kind of like comic books as, our modern mythologies. And,
Hmm.
so there's always this classic, there's the one bad day thought experiment. What
Hmm.
separated the Joker from Batman was they both had one bad day,
Yeah.
and they were both had tragedy and sin enacted upon them. And yet
Hmm.
what produced the different outcome? Because there was a degree of their agency, how they responded to that one bad day. But there also was the role of an Alfred, the people in our lives that step in and care for us. Um, that's also
Hmm.
an important part in what becomes. I mean, Vervaeke was great about this and opening up something I've never heard a theologian say about the Apostle Paul's conversion. And he brought up, yes, Paul had this transformative conversion experience right on the road to
To Damascus.
Damascus, the blinding light. But it was interesting for John to bring out that he didn't think that the Apostle Paul's conversion really happened until he went and he had to go see Ananias. And
Mm.
Ananias was the person, he was still blind, and Ananias was afraid that the persecutor of the church had entered into his house. It wasn't until Ananias cared for him and accepted him and brought him into his home that he had his sight recovered. So there is this, we're sharing this with others. It's not just this individualistic journey. All that to affirm, I think what you're saying about kind of sin with a capital S does give a much deeper weight than the trauma focus of I've been the
Yeah.
recipient of some horrible evil, and yet I have to face that thing is there present in
Yeah.
me,
I think
right?
exactly. Exactly. Solzhenitsyn's great quote about the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And in any one life, it swings enthusiastically to and fro. And we, um, we do need to be able to sort of let go of responsibility for uh, sins that are not ours to carry. That's been a huge part of my journey, is saying, like, that's not mine. I don't have to carry that.
Yeah.
But then maybe there's another step beyond that move, right? It's like, okay, I was sexually abused. I didn't choose it, and I didn't. I wasn't responsible for it, and it wasn't my fault in any way, right? Like, I can just let it go, and I can let myself feel all of it. And then there's like a point at which I can say, I can begin to forgive because my own sexual nature has the capacity for sin,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this strange thing for me, which is I've been thinking a lot about the impact of the Christian sexual revolution, right? I think people really don't understand how profoundly different the sexual mores of the Greco-Roman world were, and how monstrous
Mm-hmm.
they are to our eyes,
Yeah.
and how much it was
Absolutely.
Christianity that changed that, and how good that was for women and children. um, and yet I also see it in my life that there are people who are wounded by the Christian church's relationship to
Mm-hmm.
sexuality.
For sure.
Um, and so I had a really interesting experience. The second time I did my MDMA ceremony, I had been warned by John Vervaeke, right? Like, if you do MDMA, you may develop a limerence for women who are not your wife, right? Because it has that impact on you. And the psychedelic therapist I was working with happens to be a very attractive woman who's this around the same age, same height, same build, same coloring as my wife. So I'm going to go lay down with her under the influence of this empathy generating empathogenic thing
Mm-hmm.
after, not being sexually active for 4 months. And what's going to happen? Right. So I was really worried about that going into that second MDMA trip. And sure enough, about 45 minutes in, I started having imaginations of beginning, a sensual experience with her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting because I was able to forgive myself for that. I was able to
Mm-hmm.
recognize it as actually not bad in itself. That the
Right.
potential for connection that I had with her was not actually a bad thing. It was only a bad thing because there were more important goods. It was an
Yes.
ordering of the good, right?
Yes.
The good of our sensual connection was less important than the good of the container of the ceremony and
Mm-hmm.
the faithful trust of holding it, the respect for um, her professional position in that moment, the respect for her relationships to other men and what was going on in her life, and then of course the respect for my marriage, because my marriage was the thing that took me there in the first place, right? I was like, oh,
Right.
that's like each of these things is an ordered good, and the highest good that I can achieve as a man is to take those energies that could be directed to any number of women and put them all towards this one woman who is the mother of my children. And every time the attraction comes up, the move for me is not to shame myself, right? But to
Mm-hmm.
remember, to awaken to the fact that that is a lower order good of a good that I already experience in its highest potential expression. And to just remind myself, there's where I need to go. There's where I need to put that energy.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's the move that I hope that people can make, or that I believe in people making, is something like that, of saying, uh, we have these drives and they are really actually good. They're meant to be
Mm-hmm.
there, right? I love this image of Adam meeting Eve in the garden and saying, "At last," right? We have a nature that's meant to be united, and there's something incredibly beautiful about it. Um, but it's also so dangerous. It's so
Mm-hmm.
dangerous because it's so powerful, and men have done the worst things to women because of it, and women to men to some degree, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not quite as bad, but
Yeah.
but
Different kinds.
yeah, but certainly, like, you look at the history of male violence and coercion, and and so much of that is predicated on dehumanizing women, of
Mm-hmm.
not being able to see them. And the reality is that I think every man has the capacity to like look at a woman and see the fullness of her humanity, and and to treat her in that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Christianity actually was magnificent in what it did to the world in bringing forth the capacity for men and women to love each other like that. And that's a legacy that is of extraordinary importance to me, and that I hope people can understand and respect.
Yeah, the misperceived good, right? That's an Augustinian
Yeah.
idea that people,
Yeah.
most people, I mean, there's some good pushback to this. That there are certainly people so warped, have been so deformed in the soul that they do pursue that which they know is evil. But I think the more common temptation is the misperceived good, that
I
which
agree.
is a good, but as you mentioned, is a lesser ordered good. And I wonder, maybe this is a conversation for another time, but it does make me think about the ways in which, I think it's in Luke's gospel that they announce, the gospel of Luke says, like, the coming of Christ coincided with the fullness of time, like, which was
Mhm.
weird. I've long wrestled with that, which is like, well, what do you mean the fullness of time? It's the first century. I'm thinking this anachronistically,
Yeah.
going, oh, you don't even have the internet. You don't have, um,
Yeah.
you know, But I do think about the kind of overlap with biology and evolutionary psychology on this point, and going, okay, part of what we've inherited is the programming from a world of scarcity, but we now live in a world of abundance, right? So that drive in a world of scarcity to reproduce, even for example, in the male, in which life
Hmm.
expectancy may be lower, there may have been a way in which, in a different world, your ancestors' proclivity for
Yeah.
polyamorous relationships may have, at a particular time,
Hmm.
been a lesser good,
Hmm.
like an acquiescence to the environmental conditions of the world at that time.
Sure.
But that thing is still baked into you, and you don't live in a world of scarcity anymore. You live in a world of abundance, which cuts both ways. So, the desire, obesity, right? Obesity is our inherent hardwiring from a world of scarcity. We now have a Costco that we walk through
Yeah.
that has abundance all around us. So there's a mismatch between like our drives, our nature. And this is why, for me, I think like the Christian story just overlaps so perfectly, because it's naming something on a whole nother level of mythological true myth, of
Hmm.
something that now we're getting more insights in, that our ancestors, even a few hundred years ago, wouldn't have understood about the human species. Is that same drive that's there from a world of abundance that I've wondered, circling this back into the Christ coming in the fullness of time, that there's a project in creation, a project of renewal, in which if we are to live in a kingdom of God, which is filled with abundance, and we are to retain our free will, we need to have our characters so transformed to handle that abundance, right? To not be in a world of scarcity, to handle that abundance in such a way that our character can maintain and carry the weight of that, to act rightly in a world in which we do have more resources available to us. There would be less hunger, less scarcity, and yet we
Hmm.
don't use the scarcity programming to monopolize, to
Yeah.
respond with greed, to respond with lust. So, I mean, that's probably a much longer, more theoretical conversation, but it made me think about that as you were sharing that, Rafe. It was like, yeah, that drive, where did that come from? Yes, there's like a spiritual capacity to this, but how do I make the right brain and the left brain harmonize, right? So
Hmm.
we're speaking a lot together right now in that sort of right hemispheric noetic knowing, the spiritual discernment, which
Yeah.
is an important thing that I think we're recovering. But I am always like, for both of our backstories of a world in which people only used that and they didn't have the check and balance of, can we check these patterns up against our faculties of reason and empirical um, empiricism, to say,
Hmm.
oh, are they in harmony? So I'm often finding myself in these conversations trying to make the worlds come together. And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
I,
Any other thoughts?
well, I wanted to reflect back on that because it was this thought that I was thinking earlier in the conversation as well, of this sense of like the necessity of the left brain as a disciplining or questioning of the potential of the right brain to overgeneralize, and also to
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, maybe Miguel Gris might think I'm totally off base here, but um, there's this uh, like I said, I think a lot about sexual ethics. I think sexual ethics are one of the most difficult things to get right. I think
Yeah.
that nothing is more beautiful and powerful than when men and women really love each other and then are able to really love children. And I think it's very hard, and we get it wrong all the time. And I think that when we look at like the ethnographic record, we actually see a lot of examples of how it breaks and goes wrong and can be really, really bad. And there's a few examples of how it can be good. But I actually think the Western tradition has some really uniquely beautiful things in the way that we have been able to build that. And I think even as we try to shed some of the 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 the, the not good aspects of it, or the bad or
Mhm.
evil aspects of it, we're often failing to see the baby in that bathwater. That even is that is the lens by which we can see what is bad. Um,
Yeah.
but what struck me when you were talking about the charismatics and the Pentecostals and how they're similar to the New Age is how often these spiritual teachers who live in this ambiguous space of the paradox and the feel, they seem to be able to escape the implications of their own ethical principles in a
Hmm.
way that, uh, you know,
That's,
like
yeah.
my mom's guru was Amrit Desai. And one of his big things that he talked about a lot was the importance of marriage and the power of it. And then it turned out that he had like 27 women who were being like hidden around the country by his disciples so he could have all these affairs. Um, and I mean, I think we've talked about the idea that like a lot of charismatic churches have a similar problem with these charismatic,
Yep.
I think I disagree fundamentally with the move of a um, celibate clergy. I think that it creates its own potential incentive structure that goes wrong, in the direction of abusing
Yep.
children. But I think that
Yep.
it actually that people really don't understand how profound charismatic spiritual power is and how easy it is to abuse for men to convince
Mm.
women to have sex with them. And so like the
Yeah.
idea of a celibate priesthood is actually like a really profound protection against that, the abuse of that power. And a lot of times young religious movements, they really fall prey to those dynamics and spiritual movements.
Mm.
Um, and so that's where that like, okay, you can have faith, you can believe, you can be moved by the Spirit, but do you walk your talk?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that like the disciplining aspect is so important. And this is, we probably can't quite go all the way down that, but this is where I think the physical practices can really, really become a
Yeah.
part of our understanding because they can ground us in reality. And when they're used and understood as character development things, they can force us to adopt a discipline, and they can really be a crucible of discipline that we can then apply to our epistemological, spiritual, theological, you know, aspects and
Mm-hmm.
modes of operation. And without the capacity to wrestle and to discipline and to do the hard thing, and the teamwork and all those things, like I think it's harder to generate those higher order principles and be able to live them out. Um,
Yeah.
so that's kind of the idea for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that reminds me of, you see the Apostle Paul frequently use the term the flesh, right? The
Mm-hmm.
things of the flesh, that there being this antagonistic process that he's trying to reflect on between the flesh and the spirit. And that can sound Gnostic. It's not Gnostic, but it is an acknowledgement that there seems to be like kind of like something in the body, right? There's something
Mm-hmm.
in he wouldn't have used genetics. There's something in your genetic hardwiring that creates in you proclivities which don't scale, right? So they wouldn't scale to a world of abundance and flourishing maximally. And that's where even the Western, the ethic that's become the sexual norm in the West, albeit needs some reformation. Um, there's a lot of really damaging things about Christian purity culture, and that creates layers of shame and really difficult things about it. But when you compare, let's say, monogamous civilizations to polyamorous civilizations, and you start looking at things like homicide rates, because what ends
Mm-hmm.
up happening in the polyamorous, which was, some people, like you see an Andrew Tate make this kind of argument that this is how it's always been and we need to recover
Yeah.
that you have one dominant alpha, but what that ends up doing is, when you take out of the mating competition, if you will, you take out large swaths of men who no longer have a chance at women. They actually turn to violent,
Mm-hmm.
miscreant, deviant behaviors. And so when you think about this as kind of like in the game theory lens,
Yeah.
and you go, okay, on a civilizational scale, you take civilization A that practices a historically Christian sexual ethic, and you take civilization B, which is kind of like Rome or even
Mm-hmm.
pre-Rome,
Yeah.
polyamorous. and you play
Yeah.
that out over 100 years, 200 years,
Yeah.
you're you want you want civilization A, right? That's the one that's going to
Yeah.
lead to more flourishing.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of research on this anthropologically about polygynous cultures have high rates of of violence, high rates
Yeah,
of spousal violence. You have, you know,
yeah.
if you have 10 wives, you're not going to satisfy them. You're not going to make them happy, right? They're not going to be loyal to you
Yeah.
because of that. So the rates of mate guarding tactics, which end up being abusive, are way higher. Cheating rates are way higher.
Violence
Um,
towards the children,
yeah,
right?
you know,
Among
right.
yeah.
You know, uh, like children who are not the child of their putative father are higher, so you have more paternity
Mhm.
uncertainty, more violence, less connection between parents. And there's you know, we could go way deep in this, and I'd actually be very fascinated by the conversation. Um, yes, like I have a hypothesis I've been working with recently that Christianity actually saved the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. It didn't arrive in time to save the West. But the fundamental problem of there were two fundamental problems I think that drove the Roman civilization into the ground, which were urbanization and an extremely libertine sexual culture. The normative behavior of a Roman citizen was to regularly have sex with male and female prostitutes and slaves. Um,
Mhm.
and that meant you had very late marriage for elite males. You had relatively low rates of like actual mating in marriage, and so you had extremely high rates of infertility. Right, venereal disease is extremely common in a system like that. So very low fertility. So what you see is that uh, they're just not good at producing Romans. Right, if you
Mm.
look at Roman dynasties, they're very short lived because they don't produce enough children to carry it on, and that's happening across the whole society. And then urbanization, urban areas are their population sinks in every civilization up until sanitation, modern sanitation, and antibiotics, and the Roman civilization was more urbanized than anything that had happened before it across most of its regions. So you combine those two things, and basically what happens is that they're constantly having to try to recruit new people into being Roman. And then the speed at which they have to recruit the new people into being Roman
And
is
assimilate them.
increasing. And they are not, and over time, they just increasingly fail to assimilate them. So it's like, you
Mhm.
know, the Illyrians become good Romans, but then the Goths don't. And then the
Yeah.
Goths have to have their own separated territory, their own legal codes, and eventually it all breaks down. Um, so when Christianity comes in and says, be fruitful and multiply, you know, a man and a woman are one flesh, um, that actually stabilizes it. And the Byzantines have much more stable, the Eastern Roman Empire ends up having much more stable dynasties after a certain point because they've actually fully imbibed the Christian sexual ethos. So it is profound and civilizationally important to understand these dynamics. And of course, in our current cultural moment, that's definitely not something people want to think about a lot. But I'm trying to find to square the balance because I think we have to think about this civilizationally, but also personally. And I know so
Yeah.
many people personally who are deeply, deeply hurt by the level of
Yeah.
shame and incapacity to integrate their own sexuality as
Mhm.
human beings. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm still working on how to hold those different poles personally.
You and me both, brother. And I've grown up in this thing, so
Yeah,
that's definitely something. Well, Rafe, thanks for doing this, man.
yeah,
Let's not
likewise.
make it another 2-year gap here because I always appreciate our conversations, and yeah, I'm thankful for you.
Thank you. Likewise, Paul. It's really just a pleasure to be able to share a conversation of this depth and across this kind of variety of subjects. So
Yeah.
thanks for having me on, and I hope we'll do it again soon.
Yeah.